Part 2, Simple Sabotage. A note from the director. March 2016. This manual is published for the information and guidance of all our friends and should be used as the basic doctrine for sedition and subversion training in preparation for active simple sabotage as a precursor to the ethics-based selective irregular warfare that will act as the final blow to the state. See Sedition, Subversion and Sabotage Field Manual Number 1, Ethics-Based Irregular Warfare. Sedition is defined as conduct or speech inciting the rejection of established authority. Subversion implies the use of economic, overhanded, covert, or violent methods to change or abolish governments. We acknowledge that the primary mission of anarchists should be to use peaceful methods of persuasion and propaganda to educate as many people as possible as to the evils of the state and to use the positive aspects of sound economics and peaceful voluntary exchange to offer an alternative to aggression and war. We acknowledge that the vast majority of anarchists should not be involved in any violent or destructive behavior and should quickly disavow any connection to violence and destruction. But we acknowledge the self-defense sometimes requires proactive measures. We also understand that foolish actions, however morally justified, will in all likelihood not result in a positive outcome. Therefore, we submit this manual in an attempt to provide direction for those who are suited for taking the hard actions that others should wisely forego. Precautions. Generally speaking, sabotage instructions and subversive plans of all kinds should be dispersed in separate pamphlets or leaflets according to categories of operations and should be distributed with care and not broadly. They should be used as a basis for podcasts, internet articles, and low-power radio broadcasts, only for local and special cases, best directed by your local committees of friends. As a collection, such instructions should be kept on secure drives with safe encryption. Perspective. Going back into antiquity, various generations have repeated a version of the same myth, that being the idea that you are the chosen generation and you are the children of destiny. This is the dawning of a new age, or of the end of ages. The age of Aquarius has arrived. These are the end times, or Jesus is about to return, and we will be the generation who will see him returning in the clouds. This myth is not new, and it is not unique to this or any generation. One current manifestation of this myth has gained some popularity of late, that being the idea that we can have liberty in our lifetime, or escape to a Galt's Gulch where we all live in peace. Most of the salesmen for these gimmicks are simply honest believers filled with hope, serving the existing myth, but some are true con men who use these myths to milk the gullible of money or convince their followers to join some cult or movement. Usually, a dynamic leader with an outlandish personality will convince the followers to send him their cash or to migrate to some remote location. Often, once the big event fails to happen, the movement either dies or mutates into a mainstream shadow of its former self. There are a variety of causes behind this repeating myth, and the outcome can be tragic or benign or anywhere between. But the point is to recognize such myths for what they are and guard yourself from being caught up in the false hope. Our enemy, the state, is in this for the long haul. He is not attached to one government, one central banking institution, one corporation, one royal family, or one generation. The state is a deity that is older than any other organized religion. Before Vasudeva beheld Krishna, the state was old. Before Buddha contemplated the meaning of peace, the state had perfected war. Before Father Abraham was born, the state had risen, fallen, and had risen again. The state was already ancient when an Egyptian pharaoh, for the very first time, bowed his knee and lifted a sacrifice to the great Ra rising in the east. To understand the nature of the state and then to believe that you are the one magic generation that will defeat this beast is the height of arrogance. The state feels no fear of us, and its current politicians, bureaucrats, central bankers, CEOs, police, and military-industrial complex have no fear of us. Few of them even know we exist. And thus we have the advantage. Without our enemy's knowledge, we can fully infiltrate its structure. We can know what our captors are saying behind closed doors. We can plot the downfall of this deity from within the walls of its temples. But we cannot act with urgency. We must embrace wisdom and forego dynamic personalities and the giant egos that drive want-to-be leaders. We must prepare for a generational battle. We must understand the weaknesses of collectivism and central planning and develop the power of the individual independent scholar warrior. We must incorporate decentralization and distributed networks in our methods and teach the next generation how to take up this fight and continue it without depending on outlandish personalities and short-sighted gimmicks. We must take on the challenge that our forefathers sidestepped. Yes, the state can be defeated in one generation, but it will most likely take us many generations of hard work to prepare that generation for its task. Thus far, most of the work done by anarchists has been confined to talking and arguing while repeating the same mistakes earlier anarchists have repeated since the time of their fathers. Now we must mature in wisdom and start developing the long battle. It's time for us to set aside the expectation of a great man to deliver us. It's time to ignore the cute cheerleaders, of all genders, on the sidelines and realize there is a hard and bloody task ahead and not everyone is fit for it. Not every step is a step in the right direction, and if we're going to reach the destination we seek, we must plot out that path and stop running after every melodic voice that we hear in the wind. Finally, this field manual is not a step-by-step literal guide. It is an outline of concepts. It is intended to stimulate thought. Some suggestions contained herein will be more valuable than others. Some suggestions will quickly become outdated. That is the reason this manual is listed as provisional, because it is not set in stone. The greatest weapon a human being owns in his own mind, and that is a weapon the state lacks. We expect you will use yours. Grigory Rasputin 5, Director, Committee of Friends, Office of Sedition, Subversion and Sabotage, Lego Distribution Network, Yefimovich Pokrovskoy, Free Oblast. 1. Introduction to the basic concepts of simple sabotage. 1-1. Why? The purpose of this manual is to justify and characterize simple sabotage, to outline its possible effects, and to present suggestions for inciting and executing it to its fullest. We understand that the concept of the state is a mental construct based on the existence of coercive, monopolistic governments in conjunction with key codependent corporations and others used to control, manipulate, and enslave humanity. We understand that this system of coercive monopoly is nothing more than the current manifestation of the most successful crime gangs working in conjunction to extort the maximum amount of wealth from the residents of their respective agreed-upon geographic territories. Further, we understand that coercive, central planned governments are inheritably flawed, both morally and economically, and are thusly unstable. Left to themselves, violent governments tend to collapse, but in their fall they are typically replaced by an equally unstable and corrupt crime gang that become the new government, often made up of the most violent elements of the previous government. Therefore, it is not the purpose of this manual to hasten the fall of one government so that it can be replaced by another. Rather, it is our goal to destabilize the concept of the state in the minds of its believers around the world so that we may all escape this cycle of coercion and slavery. To accomplish this goal, we are encouraging acts of sabotage as a method of exposing the instability and the failures of all governments to provide the services that they claim the monopolistic right to control. A common fallacy that has worked to pacify one generation after the next is the idea that capitalism is the true evil and inequality is the enemy of humanity. That's right, ambiguous words are our enemy. In this scenario, the faithful believer mostly ignores the concept of the coercive state and is convinced that with enough central planning, by just the right people or some great man, benevolent government can redistribute wealth and everyone will get a piece of the pie. In fact, this silly notion ignores the hard facts of economics and is founded on an amazing ignorance of history coupled with a childish lack of morals. The fantasy that perfect central planning will produce equality and that will turn produce the perfect man who will be thrilled to live his life sweating in a communal factory or standing in line for bread, has instead always produced crushing poverty and starvation, followed by mass death and eventual government upheaval or revolution. Then finally, the adoption of the very type of capitalism that was hated to begin with. This capitalism actually being fascism in economic terms. Another common fallacy that has hindered many organized movements toward freedom is the myth that to shrink government or government's influence to a manageable size would somehow weaken government and make the slavery of the coercive state acceptable. A segment of each generation believes that if they can wrestle control of government, perhaps through secession or through infiltration of government by patriots or some great man, usually a politician, celebrity, or military hero, then the nature of human beings will magically shift and coercion on a smaller, local level will produce lasting peace and freedom. In other words, the beatings will continue until morale improves. Of course, this never happens. Coercion only produces more coercion. Theft doesn't stimulate productivity, it stimulates poverty and more theft. Prisons don't produce obedient, docile citizens, they produce harder criminals. Rape doesn't stimulate love and affection, it creates hate and retribution. Small, weak tyrants provide the opportunity for larger, stronger tyrants. Much like revolution, secession, and conservative policies simply lead to a change of guards on the prison walls, with more violent, deadly tyrants heading up local serfdoms that eventually become absorbed or annexed back into a developing empire, and the cycle repeats. The conservative dreams of a mythical past when government was good, but in fact that history is a lie that never happened. Government was never good, and the founding fathers of today's conservatives were the progressive tyrants of yesterday's conservatives. In the end, both of these parties are simply the socialist veil of lies and tricks behind which the state has hidden throughout its bloody reign of terror. Misdirected belief in these myths has shown consistently to be the very foundations of which the perpetuation of state rests. Say not, quote, "Why were the former days better than these?" unquote, for it is not from wisdom that you ask. Ecclesiastes 7:10. In addition to everything stated above, history displays for us a predictable cycle that must be broken if humanity is ever to achieve freedom or in fact even survive as a species. It is the nature of humans to suffer inconvenience and oppression rather than risk drastic and dangerous change right up to the point that they can no longer tolerate the oppression. When they are frustrated to the point of uprising, typically some government actor, commonly an orator or military leader, will rise up to speak for the downtrodden. Violent action is taken and government either falls into bloody revolution, mass murder and war, then into the hands of a worse tyrant than before, or it appears to take on a dramatic, metamorphic transformation into a manageable, more tolerable, friendly government based on promises or guarantees of rights. It seems to the short-term observer that this later development is good. In fact, it is far worse than the open tyrant. Because of the economic advantages of the friendly government, businesses flourish and the friendly government develops vast wealth and power that the openly tyrannical government could never have achieved. With this wealth, the friendly government either develops an aggressive military culture or becomes subservient to a government with an aggressive military culture, which then turns its oppression outside its borders and becomes a far more deadly force than the openly tyrannical government could ever have achieved. With fanatical followers within its own borders, a radical military culture, and a more business-friendly environment, corporate/government marriage, the friendly government becomes a far worse tyranny than it ever could have before it merged with business. Governments like this have become a force for evil that not only threatens humanity, but has now in our lifetimes become a threat to all life on the entire planet. At this point in time, it's unclear how many more cycles of good government our species can tolerate. As odd as it may seem, wishing and working for a smaller, more manageable government not only pushes the responsibility and burden to the next generation, it makes it more likely that the new version of the friendly government will become something the last generation could not have imagined. This is how the cycle of good government works. If we can come to the conclusion that we must stop doing the same thing over and over, attempting to come up with a different result, then logic drives us to the old question, what shall this man do? The answer to that question is that we must learn the true art of war and incorporate wisdom into our efforts. Recognizing the above described cycle is one aspect of the principle of knowing oneself and knowing one's enemy. We must fight in a way that disarms our enemy while strengthening ourselves. We must stop believing that using the tools governments supply to us will work to defeat the state. We must reject all political solutions. We must reject civil disobedience and every other method of begging the master for mercy. We must learn the weaknesses of central planning and collectivism and develop the strengths of independence and individuality. We must reject the idea of tearing down the military-industrial/banking complex, and we must concentrate on learning how to cause the beast to lose its footing and allow its own bloated torso to crush the thin legs that hold it up. For one practical example, we must stop silly pursuits like demanding government and the Fed, and realize that we have the power to ignore the Fed through cryptocurrencies. Let governments run their debts to the sky and devalue their money. It only helps us in the long term, as it proves our point that governments are nothing more than criminal gangs and the state is a destructive religion that needs to pass into the dust heap of history with other nonsensical, violent religions. In knowing ourselves and knowing our enemy, we must recognize the vast resource advantages that the state possesses, and we must resist every traditional military action, knowing that the state possesses an endless supply of young, foolish men who will fight and die on command. While our numbers will always be limited to a small, dedicated force, we can never fight the state using numbers, attrition, or open conflict. Considering that our enemy possesses most of the world's wealth, along with the ability to create more money on demand, it would be foolish to believe we can spend our way to victory. When fighting a vastly more powerful opponent, the wise warrior simply doesn't allow his enemy to know where or who he is. We must never openly confront the state and reveal our positions, our strength, nor our intentions. Martyrs, messiahs, heroes, and great men will not deliver us from this evil. Brave last stands, angry marches, civil disobedience, and loud proclamations will never serve our ends. Risking our numbers to occupy a physical location or region will only serve to make it easier for our enemy to find and subdue us. Openly petitioning and begging government has never and will never be the path to freedom. Openly threatening a vastly superior enemy is never wise. Our deliverance will come from an extended series of principled actions done clandestinely by individuals based on wisdom and not emotion nor hero glorification. We must choose every battlefield, and we must choose the timing and circumstances of every interaction. We must seek out our enemy's weak points and capitalize on them. We must systematically bring this beast to its knees by its own weight. This is the role of simple sabotage. Until such a time comes that our enemy is weakened to the point that the individual rifleman can finish the job by decapitation of the beast through ethics-based selective irregular warfare. In this way, simple sabotage is the precursor that will allow selective irregular warfare to be the final death blow to the state.